And then the parole is the concrete act of speaking. And it's kind of fun as humans, sometimes we cannot equate what we have here with what we say. Noam Chomsky said it best when he said, sometimes we cannot equate competence, with performance, or performance with competence. What I'm going to do today is to talk about the concept of language, the concept of liberty. What is it? We talk about the Africa we want. What is language? What is liberty? How do the two intersect in development? So that's what I'll be looking at. So let's get started. So what I've done is to structure the lecture. And by the way, let me begin by thanking the African Students Association for inviting me to come and talk. I like talking. I tell people I get paid for talking. When I came to IU 31 years ago, and I was the first Black African to be hired by IU. When I came 31 years ago, I was telling my brother, it was kind of interesting because they had what they call accent reduction. You could, the public could pay for you to get rid of your accent. And this was offered, and I turned it down. And I said, as a linguist, if I get rid of my accent, who would I be? I wouldn't be the African I want to be. I'm past 65. In fact, I turned 65 last year. And I've never dreamt speaking in English. I speak in Akan. If I'm going to do anything useful, it's going to be done through Akan. And I'll talk more about that. So I will look at the concept of language, concept of liberty, and development. I will take an interdisciplinary approach. And I know about the danger of parsimony. I'm not a lawyer. I'll be talking about law. I'm not a political scientist. I'll be talking about politics. I'm not a media expert, but I'll be talking about it. I'm a linguist. Language is my profession. Now, and then I will see how these intersect. In talking about the concept of liberty, there'll be a brief discussion and a conclusion. Now, so what is language? Language is first and foremost a cognitive experience. We are born with it. It is innate. There's a blueprint in our brains which help to build what? Building blocks. If you put a child, a normal child from anywhere in the world, in any linguistic situation, that child is going to speak or acquire the language within the ecology in which the child is placed. And so it's very important to me. Language is a cognitive experience. Now, this is situated in the frontal lobe of the brain, what we call the language centers, so that we can tell what language is and what is not language. For example, on the day of Pentecost, I'm going to religion. I teach a class called Language and Religion. On the day of Pentecost, when these guys were gathered, they began to speak in languages that they had not studied. They were speaking human languages. There were people from Persia, from Pamphylia, from Cyrene, which is Libya, from Misraim, Egypt, who heard these guys speaking in their languages. And they said, these guys are drunk. And then Peter said, we cannot be drunk. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. This is a prophecy by Joel. But let me not talk about that. At the time, what they were doing was speaking in a language they had not studied. That came from the frontal lobe of the brain. It was language. But then also we have what we call glossolalia, which is a static speech, which is not human language. It doesn't come from the frontal lobe of the brain. It comes from the social center, So it's not language, but people are able to communicate with that also. And we can talk about that later. Language is inventive, as creative. As I stand here, I can produce a sentence that I've never produced before. It's so wonderful to be in this room with these beautiful people, all listening and happy. And I don't even care if someone is sad. I've never said that sentence before, but language is inventive, it's productive, so we can do that with it. Now, language adjusts to humans' intellectual, legal, political, cultural, religious. I'll talk about some of these. Language is so important, such that without language, every human activity will come to a halt. Now, but then, it's kind of interesting. Language is actualized through speech. Remember, I've said it's a cognitive experience, but it's actualized through speech. But speech is not just a community of sounds. Speech is more than sounds. There are processes, there are aerodynamic features like loudness, tempo, rhythm. I spent my doctoral dissertation, writing on definitive features of interaction. I was looking at speaker intentions and its impact on listeners, but most importantly, how these are actualized through speech and the use of all these wonderful phonetic features that are mentioned here. Now, through sound processes, we can talk about joy, fear, affection, disbelief, whatever have you. And I have examples from Akan. Hey, Papebi, whoopee, that's beautiful. Fear. Hey, are you trying to kill us? And I'm doing it through language. Okay? Affection. I said, the love of my life. Until, of course, they find a new one. Now, surprise. Now, when you first say, what a beauty. You look so gorgeous. Dejection. It sucks. Life sucks. And then contempt. Get out of here. Now, language and the brain. We know that there's a connection between, I've said that language is situated in the frontal lobe of the brain. What happens, therefore, is that if there is any disease that affects the language centers, you're going to have what is called aphasia. It could be Wernicke's aphasia, Broca's aphasia, dysarthria. All this will impact the way you talk. If someone gets a stroke, for example, their speech is slurred. Some may have, they cannot connect sounds, with images. There are those who may not have grammar and stuff like that. So that's what, we learn about language through the brain. In fact, when I was in graduate school in the 80s, early to mid 80s, we did what was called neurolinguistics, and we would go to the hospital, and when someone had a problem, the neurosurgeons would open the skull, and with electrodes, they can tell which part of the brain was dead, and then take it out. So yes, there's a connection between language and the brain, and that's very important. Language and idea. We conceptualize stuff through language. And in fact, in Akan, the language that I study, idea is conceptualized and performed, and given meanings to the tune of our integrity, our wisdom, and whatever have you. Without language, it will be difficult, to verbalize, to put across the ideas that we have. Now, language and social action. I'll say more about this. With language, we can cross-examine people, we can campaign, we can insult, and we've seen some of that recently. Language. How about language and gender? There's an intersection between language and gender. Men and women use language differently. Whereas women, this is not my research. There's Deborah Tannen, who's a leader in this area. And what she has found was that, women use language for connectivity. They are more empathetic and stuff like that. And in some of my work on judicial discourse, what I have seen is that the women use language in a more sensible and pragmatic way than the men, and they win their cases, and the men think they are arrogant and bold, and they lose. But I will not say it. All right. Now, and this was studying the Akan community. That's what I meant by that. Now, language and place of abode. Where we live impacts how we speak. I've lived here for 31 years. I try to impress my African identity on my language, but I cannot escape the fact that occasionally there may be slippings from here and there. I've lived in England, I've lived in Ghana, I've lived here, maybe the longest, and it's kind of interesting how where we are. Someone who lives in New York will speak different English than the person who lives in the Midwest. Someone who lives in Kenya will speak English differently than, I'm saying than, whereas if I were speaking in Africa, I would say what? From, okay? Someone who comes from Ghana. So even though we are speaking English language, we speak it differently because of our geography, because of our location, okay? And then also the speaker's profession. And I'll talk more about this in Ghanaian society. If you have a certain kind of status and profession and you don't speak in a way that is consistent with your status, people will say, he's highly educated, yet his English language is so poor. I'll talk more about that. When we expect people with certain kind of status to speak in a particular kind of way. And then language and liberty. For the past 5 years, I've spent my time working on this theory, language and liberty, the intersection of language and liberty, how people who are dominated use resistive speech to challenge the validity claims of those in power. If you haven't seen that, look at people marching all over the place. The language they're using is the language of resistance. You have it in Ghana, you have it in Kenya, you have it in Nigeria, and you have it in the US. And then also language in various institutional domains. Here I talk about law, politics, medicine. We'll talk about some of these as we go along. Now, then there's language use. What I'm saying here is that language is more than just an abstract entity or a mere articulatory practice. Language is the person who speaks it and the person's ideology, whether political or whatever. So I have an example here. This from a book that I just finished. It's going to be published by the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. J.B. Dankwa, a man described as the dean of Ghanaian politics or the doyen of Ghanaian politics. Highly educated, very good English. And so this is what one person says. J.B. Prof. Now yet to the organism, so you're pet. Okay, so JB is competent. He's a competent speaker of the English language, and we understand what he says, but we don't like it. Even though we don't understand what Nkrumah says, that is what we like. So here, what I'm saying basically is that English language that is spoken well, say that it enhances understandability, is appreciated, but the political ideology of the speaker puts acceptability in jeopardy. Now, then, of course, here's a conversation that I recorded. So two guys are talking. So the first one asks, Mr. A.M., whom did you vote for? Mr. A.M., when I talk about Dr. Liman. Why? Are they French? Or French? Why? Yeah, they now so they talk about. Yeah, none of French in your grow. So this person is saying, look, I voted for this guy because he speaks French. Of course, we are in Ghana. I would have been happier if the person had said he speaks English, but he says he speaks French. And the guy asks, what? Do you cast a ballot based on the language? These are things that we may not realize, but these are very important. What language does a person speak? What is a person's ideology? How do the two intersect? Even in the electoral process, those are very important. Now, languages and their status. I think I talked about this already, so I'm not going to waste your time on it. If you have a certain kind of educational status, you're expected to speak English language or French in a particular way. And failure to do that, you get a reprimand. Now, in the same way, if you are an Akan-born, if you are a Luo, a Luya, a Bukosu person, and you cannot speak good Luya, I'm sure people will say, what? This gentleman is a Luya, yet he grinds Luya. I want to use that metaphor. He grinds Luya, And in Akan, we say Opoto, say that if a person has an accent We say, oh, Tony, he speaks with an accent.